On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to continue a study we began 2 weeks ago entitled The Passover Liturgy, found in John's Gospel. It's an incredible study. As we have looked at these 21 chapters in the Gospel of John, we have found that each story fits the Haggadah, or the Passover Seder, the ritual that the Jews go through in the observance of Passover. And for this to be done 2,000 years ago and to still fulfill the minute details of the Passover ritual to this very day is really remarkable. Let me read to you from a book by Chaim Schaus called The Jewish Festivals. This gives a thumbnail sketch of what the Jews observed 2,000 years ago. The celebration begins, he writes, all is quiet in the streets. The full moon moves over the flat roofs of Jerusalem and bedecks everything in silver. In the homes, people lounge on sofas placed around the room. The left hand rests on soft cushions. The right hand takes food and drink from small individual tables set before each feaster. One sits at the head of the room and leads in the ceremonial observance. First, a glass of wine mixed with water is taken. Then the right hand is washed, and all partake of lettuce dipped in a tart liquid. Then the sacrificial animal is served and eaten with matzo and bitter herbs dipped in caroset, a mixture of ground nuts and fruits and wine. Then begins the second part of the ceremony of the evening, reciting the story of the festival and the discussion of the ceremonies that go with it. A second glass of diluted wine is drunk, and the son of the household asks, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" His father answers him with excerpts from the Bible telling about the deliverance from Egypt, and then explains the meaning of the sacrificial lamb, the matzo, and the bitter herbs. All listen to him with great attention and devotion. And with that, we begin in John chapter 5. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the Passover liturgy in the Gospel of John.
And we have already explained on the previous program how the 4 cups are labeled, but to review, the first cup is the cup of sanctification or cleansing, and all of these labels are taken from Exodus 6, 6, and 7. The second cup is the cup of thanksgiving, in which the Lord promises that he will break their bondage. The third cup is yet future. We'll get to it later in the broadcast. It's called the cup of redemption, from the phrase, "I will redeem you." And here, the youngest child of the party is encouraged by the host to ask, "Manish Tana, why is this night different from all other nights?" And I think we've heard this question before, JR, when we see reenactments of the Passover.
Yes.
And the answer is that on this night, number one, we eat only matzah, the unleavened bread, which is the symbol of God's providence. On this night, we eat bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness of the Egyptian affliction. The third idea of difference is on this night, we dip our unleavened bread twice, and the dipping, of course, is accompanied by a recitation to help us not to forget what happened in Egypt. And number 4, on all other nights we may eat either sitting or reclining, but on this night we must eat reclining. And here's the idea of resting on the providence of God.
Now, the Gospel of John records 4 Passovers, each in perfect accordance with the 4 cups and their meanings on the Passover table. So we begin in chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This feast is the second feast of Passover. And so throughout the Gospel of John, 4 Passovers are given, and that makes the ministry of Christ 3.5 years long. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel came down at a certain season into the water and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, He saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming down, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise and take up thy bed and walk. Gary, this is an incredible miracle, but the scene set here speaks of the Jewish Passover and the troubled waters of the Red Sea, doesn't it?
Yeah, once again, and we find this all throughout the book of John, the symbol of the water. And here we have troubled waters and an impotent man who cannot cross the troubled waters. He is in bondage. In fact, I think, J.R., he's the symbol of Israel in bondage.
38 years here he has been afflicted.
Absolutely. Couldn't cross the water.
For 38 years. This is typical of the 38 years the Jews spent in the wilderness after Kadesh Barnea, when they refused to believe the spies, the two spies, Joshua and Caleb.
And the crossing of the water in the Exodus experience is very important. First, the Red Sea crossing, and secondly, the Jordan crossing when they went into the land. And that was both of those were miraculous crossings
Troubled
of the
waters.
Troubled waters. Yeah.
And so this has to be a Passover festival observed here. And one of the interesting things about this second cup is that it demonstrates the power of God.
Absolutely. When Jesus performs this miracle of helping this lame man, 38 years, this is an incredible miracle, and he does this on the Sabbath. This is no haphazard healing. He didn't just happen by there. This was done deliberately in a place at a time on the Sabbath to demonstrate that he was Lord of the Sabbath. And then, J.R., the rest of chapter 5, at this occasion, Jesus uses to illustrate his godhood. Here he expounds upon himself as divinity. He declares himself equal to the God of nature, the God of creation, equal with God the Father in power, equal with God the Father in authority, and then having been witnessed both by John the Baptist and by his own signs and wonders. And listen to the Haggadah at this point, just very briefly. At this point in the Haggadah, second cup, the deliverance of the Lord is spoken of. I will deliver you, 1, with a mighty hand, 2, with an outstretched arm, 3, with great awe, 4, with signs, and 5, with wonders. It fits, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So what Jesus had to say here in John chapter 5 about his own power, his authority, his godhood, his being equal with God, fulfills the liturgy of the second cup of the Passover. When the child says, what makes this night different from all other nights? And the father goes into the details of how powerful God is in his deliverance to them. Yeah. And this also brings us to what is called the Dayenu.
Yeah, Dayenu. There is a recitation. Dayenu is Hebrew for it would have been enough for us. And the host recites various sayings. For example, he brought us out of Egypt. The participants say, Dayenu. That would have been enough for us. But he executed judgments against them. And the crowd says, Dayenu. That would have been enough for us. And it goes on and on and on, J.R., until we get to, he brought us to Mount Sinai. Had he just brought us here, and the crowd says, Dayenu, that would have been enough for us. And it goes on and on and on from there. Had he just come down upon the mountain, it would have been enough. Had he just come down on the mountain and not given us the law, it would have been enough. But he gave us the law. And this recitation continues in a review of the power of God, bringing them out, taking them to the mountain, and giving them the Torah by divine decree. So, again, the second cup is a recitation of God's power and his authority, just as we find in John chapter 5.
Now, also at this point, the leader of the Passover ceremony dips his finger in wine and drops them on the cedar plate, the Seder plate. I'm having a time with my Texas accent here. Seder plate. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Seder meaning order in Hebrew. Meaning things are done in order. And at this point, God's deliverance in the plagues is remembered with drops of wine. The host dips his finger in the wine 10 times, and he splashes a little drop of wine on a plate. Number 1, blood. Number 2, frogs. Number 3, vermin. Number 4, wild beasts. Number 5, pestilence. All the way to number 10, death of the firstborn. And you end up with 10 drops of symbolic blood on a plate, J.R. And what a symbol that is.
That's incredible. In the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus heals a man at the pool of Bethesda. Later in the day, he sees the man again, and he says, you've been made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. I believe this man was typical of Israel, who was saved from Egypt and brought out into the wilderness. And then God said, sin no more, lest a worse thing come. Well, they did sin more, and we have seen history attest to the fact that worse things did come upon the house of Israel. Now that brings us then to the 3rd Passover and the 3rd cup, which we shall see in John chapter 6. The fascinating thing about this Passover, which, by the way, verse 4 says, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. So we're in chapter 6, verse 4, at the 3rd Passover. Jesus gives the recitation, or the dissertation, on the bread. That brings us then to the afikomen and the unleavened bread.
It certainly does, because a very big part of the Passover occurs at the beginning of the Passover, J.R. We have 3 matzos, 3 squares of unleavened bread. The middlemost of those is removed from the pack, broken in 2. The larger half of it is put back in the pack. The small half is given to someone who will then hide that. And at the complete end of the meal, in fact, at the end of supper, a small child or children are sent to find that hidden matzo, and then it comes back and is used to conclude the service.
Of course, this is the cup of redemption, so we're talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ in this, aren't we?
Absolutely. This is a symbol of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ.
And the matzo has stripes on it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It just for baking purposes, you put stripes on it to keep it from puffing up and bubbling up. And so it's striped and bruised and wounded, and it reminds us of several of the passages in Isaiah that speak about his stripes and his wounds.
Mm-hmm. In chapter 6, we notice that a child has 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds the 5,000 with these, the multiplication of the loaves. Mm-hmm. This is a fulfillment of the Passover liturgy, as the Jews explain that God has provided for them this great provision.
Absolutely. And now the 3rd cup, which we're getting into, is called the cup of redemption. Redemption is the whole process of salvation that involves the sacrifice of Christ. It involves various betrayals, sorrows, torments, separations. It involves a lot of things, but that are fully culminated at the final cup. But J.R., the 3rd cup of redemption, featuring the prelude, which is the eating of the remainder of the afikomen that hasn't been hidden. It's broken up, and to each member of the party is given 1/2 egg measure by law of matzo, which he must then consume before taking the 3rd cup. This consumption of the broken matzo, followed by the 3rd cup of redemption, to me is absolutely significant of John chapter 6, where we find Jesus announcing that he's the bread of life and that his blood is to be the element of salvation.
Mm-hmm. So we have here the bread and the wine depicted by the blood and body, or body and blood of Christ.
Absolutely.
Now, also I want you to notice that in each one of these cups of the Passover table, they are all typical of troubled waters. Mm-hmm. For example, the 1st cup was diluted with water. Well, that reminds us of the marriage in Cana, you know, where the water became wine. And in fact, out of the riven side of Christ flowed blood and water. That is a fulfillment of this Passover liturgy, mm-hmm. As well as the other prophetic or spiritual significances of it. Here Jesus in chapter 6 walks on the water. In fact, after feeding the people, he sends them away, sends the disciples into a boat across the Sea of Galilee, and then he goes up into a mountain and hides himself. This is the hiding of the afikomen, isn't it?
It certainly is. And the recitation that is read here at the third cup is, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who nourishes the entire world in his goodness, with grace, with kindness, with mercy. He gives nourishment to all flesh, for his kindness is eternal. And through his great goodness we have never lacked, and may we never lack nourishment." This is the subject that then leads up to the taking of the third cup, J.R. Yeah. This is the subject of the feeding of the 5,000.
And that dissertation on "I'm the bread and all you want is bread," and I've got something far greater than that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is amazing. Now, I want you to listen to what Chaim Schaus writes. This is a Jewish man about the Jewish festivals. He's speaking of this afikomen. Part of it is kept back by Jews as a good luck charm. Mm-hmm. It's not completely eaten. Part of that broken matzo is kept back. He writes, the Jews of Morocco are also fond of dramatization on Pesach Eve, or Passover Eve. He says, these Moroccan Jews carry away with them from the Seder a piece of the afikomen, the matzo saved for the end of the meal. They carry it as a safeguard on ocean voyages and throw it into the waters in time of storm, claiming that it has powers to calm the sea. Well, that's a Jew writing about what Jews do who reject Jesus Christ, and yet we have here at the feeding of the 5,000 and the dissertation of the bread, we have Jesus walking on the water and calming the storm.
Calming the storm, presenting himself as the bread of life. By the way, here's a note that's interesting. The word afikomen is not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. And for many, many years, for centuries, people have asked the question, well, why do the Jews use a Greek word to describe this broken middle matzo, which is hidden, then brought out at the end of the dinner? Why do they use a Greek word? The traditional answer is that it comes from the Greek epikomios, which means dessert dish or after dish or that which comes after. But J.R., it is a fact, and you can find it in any Greek lexicon. Afikomen is the future tense masculine singular Greek. New Testament Greek, afikomen means I come. Now, is that a prophecy or what?
That's incredible. And to me, the fact that it's Greek shows the Gentile nature of the dispensation of grace. He has enlarged this plan of salvation to include the Greeks, or the Gentiles. And, you know, that's what we have as we move from the Gospels into the epistles. And through the book of Acts, from Pentecost and afterwards, everything sort of moves toward Gentiles, doesn't it?
It does. And in chapter 6 of John, the third Passover, it says in 6:1, after these things Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. So he gives it the Gentile name. The Sea of Galilee also has a Gentile name, Tiberias. Wow. And this third cup, then, is the age of grace, and it's the body and blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. And
also, in like manner, the New Testament is written in Greek, whereas the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. So we can see the Gentile flavor, the Greek nature of this development of the Passover to provide salvation for all men.
Now Jesus says, among many other proclamations, John 6:54, whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. He has resurrection power. Now, the Jews, many, were offended at this. And then we read in John 6:66, that's an interesting number, isn't it? Mm-hmm. John 6:66, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. They didn't want to hear about this body and blood being broken and shed. And also, we have introduced here, at the very end of the chapter, Jesus answered them, have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? He spake of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for he it was that should betray him, being one of the 12. J.R., we have the introduction of the betrayal of Christ, which would lead to his blood sacrifice.
Shades of the Antichrist.
Yes.
In chapter 6, verse 66 and following.
Isn't that amazing?
When they did not believe in him, they turned and walked with him no more. All of these things, as is told in the Gospel of John, fulfilled the minute, detailed ritual of Jewish liturgy for the Passover. And it's amazing to me that Theologians have overlooked this, and no commentary ever mentioned this down through history. Fascinating that the Lord should open it up and we should be able to see such things in these days. Surely we must be near to the final fulfillment of the great Passover.